All right, I guess it's finally time for me to talk about resource systems. Resource systems! This is going to span not just RPGs, but tabletop games in general. A lot of games use resource systems. Most. Not all. Most. You've got... in D&D, you generally have spell slots, or in 4th edition, you have encounter-based resources and you have daily-based resources. All versions of D&D, you have hit points, which are a daily resource. Sometimes you can get back some, but it's still largely a daily resource. You kind of have a maximum number of hit points you can go through in a day. Let's just have that really dynamic camera follow me all over the car. Yeah. In other RPGs, you have things like, mana that you might need to manage. You have spell points or ability points that you build up. This happens in video games too. You generate ability points of some sort, whatever they call them, and then you spend them to do special abilities while you are, in between doing whatever it is that generates those ability points. This happens all the time. In board games, you generally have some kind of money or purchasing power. Sometimes these systems are really ephemeral and they kind of stretch the definition of a resource. For example, many deck building games, your buying power, whatever you don't use in a turn, goes away. And so it's less of a resource and more of a per turn budget. I hesitate to even call that a resource, really, because it's so ephemeral. I would like to talk about resources for taking actions, resources that carry over from turn to turn, can build up, and making decisions about when and how to spend these resources is a big part of the gameplay experience. Those are the kinds of resources I want to talk about today. This is present to mind for two reasons. One, the MCDM RPG that is in development by Matt Colville. He's said a lot of things about resources, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't. Now, I do like the idea that resources are typically, let's not alliterate too hard. They are typically accumulated over time. Like during your turn or during other people's turns, things happen that cause you to gain resources. Or sometimes maybe you just gain resources at the start or end of your turn or whatever. But your resources go up, which removes one of the problems with D&D combat. And a lot of, I would say, the classically designed RPGs, where you start the day with maximum resources and it only goes down. And what that means is that fights get less interesting the more of them you have, and each fight gets less interesting the longer it goes on. Because you have fewer resources, there are fewer enemies. The whole scale of it just sort of dwindles down. And this leads to a situation where, maybe you don't even want to finish the fight. Maybe it's kind of bumming out the pacing of the game to even finish the fight, to get to the actual conclusion of the fight. And the GM would probably be well advised to just say, all right, you guys are going to win. Let's clean up. Move on with the story. And yeah, that's a decent solution to the problem, but it doesn't mean that the problem isn't there. And that problem is kind of inevitable for any system where all of your resources are based on a rest. Or waiting for an elapsed time. Because in 3rd edition, I believe, you didn't actually need to rest to recover your spell slots. They just recovered no, actually, that's not right. I think for divine casters, they just recovered at a certain time of day. You had to do your prayers, and then you got all your spell slots back. And then for arcane casters, I believe you had to rest and then prepare spells. And it's kind of functionally the same thing. In practice, it generally comes out to be the same thing. But instead, if you have a resource that is generated by events that happen during an encounter or during the day, then your resources can actually go up. And either you spend those resources or you can do things based on how much of that resource you have. So you have spent or not spent resources. And the MCDM RPG has a mixture of both of these. But importantly, you are generating resources as you go. So you are not running out. You might run out at a certain point, but you're going to get more. And I think that is just really good design for engaging players, for making sure that like you can make the decision to do the fun thing without thinking about how it's going to screw you later when you don't have enough resources to do the fun thing. That's just really good design. Now, what I don't agree with is these sort of assertions that they should have every class, every character type. I assume they're using classes. I think they're using classes. So I haven't actually looked at any of the rules. I've only looked at like their videos and their like statements about the system. I have not looked at the system proper. But what I don't agree with is that every class needs to use a different resource system in order to feel unique. I think you can very easily, and probably more easily than making a unique resource system for every class, you can make classes that play very differently, have a completely different player experience while using the same resource system. Case in point, 4th edition, where for a while, there are exceptions, of course, every class uses the same, it's still there a little bit, it's still there. Every class uses the same resource system. But because they are spending it to do very different things, they don't feel the same at all. They only look the same on a surface level. Like if you are looking at it and you don't look too hard and you don't try it, they will look like they are functionally the same. That is why I get so annoyed when people say that like, oh, well, all classes in 4th edition are the same. When they're very not. Like anyone can see that they're not if you look for more than a second. It's one of the most annoying arguments because like it instantly identifies the person as someone who has never tried it and they don't know what they're talking about. It's completely false. But they use the same resources. And so this is the thing that you can do. And so I disagree with Matt Colville and his crew. I assume they are in agreement with him when he says that like, they want that it's important to differentiate classes based on their resource systems and they all have to have a different resource system. And I believe he's actually come around on this, cause if I'm recalling correctly, the video where he talks about the resources, maybe was it video or was it text? I don't even remember. The statement that they made about it was that they were sort of coming around on the idea that like they can be called different things while functioning the same, and that's fine. Sure, if that's what you got to do. I think it kind of makes the system a little bit messier, just having different resources, because now you can't have a rule that refers to all their resources without listing them all. You know, like if I wanted to have a rule in the game, in a game, where if you are completely out of resources, something happens. There's some condition, you know, some effect, or maybe a monster that gets more powerful if you have no resources left. Well, that's really hard to write in a system where everyone has resources that are called something different. You know, I guess that you just don't do that in a system like that. Kind of limits design space a bit, makes it a little bit messy. I find it slightly inelegant, but you can get away with it. Like I'm not saying like you shouldn't ever have classes with different resources. Obviously, like you can do a lot. It does open up quite a bit of design space to have classes that just approach the concept of generating resources very differently. Obviously, there are considerable advantages to doing so. I'm saying that it creates some peculiarities in how the rules can be written to interact with those resources and how player options can interact with those resources that I'm not sure that I like, which is kind of one of the reasons, one of several reasons why I am keeping an interested eye on the MCDM RPG. I'm not sold on it yet. There's what I would call yellow flags. There's no red flags yet. there are some yellow flags. Like, these are things that I need to be concerned about with regards to the game design. But I am still quite interested, and I will absolutely be checking it out at some point once they have like a public playtest document. I'll be looking at that. And this also spills over. So the MCDM thing was one reason why this is on my mind. The second reason why this is on my mind is because someone asked me to talk about card games. Card games use resource systems, generally speaking, by and large. And the different resource systems that I've seen have all created vastly different experiences for playing the game. We must start, of course, with the big daddy of all card games, Keyforge. I'm kidding, of course. No, can you imagine? No, it's Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering has what I would call an extremely obnoxious resource system. It is a ramping up, well, kind of. It usually, typically, the expectation is that it ramps up over time, so you have more resources on each turn. But it takes up room in your deck, which means that since you are only drawing one card, you might be drawing one of the interesting cards that does something in the game, or you might be drawing a card that lets you play the game. And you probably aren't drawing something that does both. Which, really incentivizes, like, adding more cards that let you draw cards. And B, can be really disappointing, especially if on a random draw, you don't get one of those two categories that you need. And there's always in card games the issue of like, oh, maybe you don't draw what you need. This is a little bit different because like if you get land flooded or land screwed, you just aren't playing the game. It's not that you're playing suboptimally or that you are getting not quite the right tools and you have to make do with them. You just don't play the game. If you get nothing but land, you're done. If you don't get land, you are done. Like, you just can't play with either of those two outcomes. And even with a perfectly mathematically ideal distribution of land in your deck, that's going to happen sometimes. Like, it's just part of the game. Sometimes you get land screwed. Sometimes you get land flooded. It happens. There are things you can do to sort of insulate yourself against it, but it still happens. So I don't like Magic's resource system. Mainly for that reason. There are times when it feels good, when you're hitting the land drops when you need them, and you get your mana curve just right, and you're actually able to play out the cards, and you're not getting too much land, you're not getting too little land, then it feels okay. But it's like to roll the dice to see if the resource system, the basic thing that lets you play the game, works right. Like, that's kind of a weird, bad design, isn't it? Isn't it? I think that's kind of a bad design. A much better design are two main options for a better resource system that in my opinion. Since this is Sabrok's Opinions, I'll tell you what Sabrok's opinion is. One, you've got a system like Android Netrunner, where you have a resource that you can generate with actions in the game. And you can just freely generate more of that resource instead of doing other things. Like, there's clearly going to be other things you want to do. You can instead just generate more resources. And then you can optionally and maybe advisedly have more cards in your deck that let you generate resources faster. Either with an all-in-one burst that gives you a bunch, or maybe a card that with some investment allows you to generate more resources over time. That kind of thing. I think that is a really good resource system for certain types of games. Obviously, it's not going to be for everything. Certain card formats just aren't going to work with that. But it does allow you to sort of generate or to create a sort of economic situation where the players are having to, there's the competition of not only how many resources can I generate, how many resources do I want to generate? Am I willing to spend the actions and the cards to create these resources? Or do I need to do something else that is more urgent? And that can create a really interesting play dynamic between them. Android Netrunner honestly was just a really good card game. And as I understand it, it still is. With the Nisi Corporation continuing it, it's like I've heard people say that it's even better now than it was when I was playing, which is several years ago. I honestly regret selling. I sold my Android Netrunner collection, and I regret selling it more and more every day. I wish I hadn't. I have a group of people that I know who I could play with. Anyways, this video is going a bit long, so I'm going to jump into the other resource system for card games, which is the Legend of the Five Rings card game. Oh, I've talked about the Legend of the Five Rings RPG here before. I haven't talked about the card game before. Oh, the resource system in that is just very good. You get a large lump sum of resources every turn. And then there's trickling resources from doing certain things, like passing first in a certain phase of the game, or choosing one of the elemental rings to attack with that didn't get chosen in the previous round. Those build up. Fate is the name of the resource. Those build up fate, and then when you choose that, you get all the fate on that ring. And then there's a couple of other things. There are a few cards that can generate resources. They're not that common. They're not super popular. Because for the most part, you plan on having your 7 per turn plus maybe 1, maybe 2 more, depending on how it is that you plan on playing your deck. But here's the cool thing. They carry over from turn to turn. That is a big deal. Resources that carry over from turn to turn really incentivize very careful play. You got to think about the future. You got to think about, like, I could play this big card right now, or I could wait. I could play only smaller cards, and maybe this turn is a little bit weaker, but I'm building up resources for a future turn. And then at a certain point, you're like, okay, I'm emptying the bank, and I'm going to put out all these big characters, put tons of fate on them, because there's a mechanic where you put fate on the characters and they stick around longer. So like I'm really investing in my board now, and I'm going to go down to, like, 0 or 1 or 2 fate remaining for whatever cards are in my hand. And I'm just going to flood the board, and I'm going to have a really, really strong turn. And being able to get to that point and knowing when that point should be are skills to develop during the game. And importantly, it's not random. I don't have my deck telling me when I'm going to have resources. I just have them. I can do actions in the game that allow me to conserve resources or to generate additional resources potentially. Those are decisions that I can make. But I don't have, like, just randomly coming up like, well, today I have nothing to spend my resources on because all I have is land. Or I have no land, so I don't get to play. So go ahead, have your free whole round. That doesn't happen. It never happens. Every time I see someone getting land flooded or land screwed in Magic, I'm like, we could be playing a game where you don't have random resources. And they get really annoyed when I say that, because I say it all the time. Oh, Legend of the Five Rings is such a good property. It's ridiculous. It's a good game. So, fun fact, I have played Legend of the Five Rings, the LCG, and that is what I'm talking about, by the way. I've not played the AEG CCG, the AEG CCG of L5R. I've not played that. I've only played the LCG from Fantasy Flight. But I did play that at basically the highest available level. Well, maybe not the highest, one of the highest. I went to a grand championship once. And I came top of clan through the Swiss rounds with a deck that no one had seen before, because I developed it myself. I was sort of the pioneer of the Honor Lion deck. I did completely choke in the first round of the cut against honestly one of the strongest players in the world, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, that was more or less the end of it, because COVID happened right after that. So, and then the game died. Weird. And I was just struck with how much better this game is as you get better. Like, as you become more skilled in the game, the quality of play and the interesting decisions only get better. Whereas, from my observations, the better your deck is in Magic and the better you are at building decks in Magic and the better you are at playing Magic, kind of the less interesting it gets because it gets way less interactive. The whole strategy of Magic is don't let the opponents play at the highest levels, obviously. Like there's casual decks, but you kind of have to intentionally shackle yourself when you're playing Magic. Don't build the best deck you can because no one wants to play against that. It's not fun. So I think Magic's kind of a bad game in general. Big part of that is owing to its resource system, but there's additional problems just with the fact that it's so bloated. It's just, there's too much content in Magic. There's just too much. But that could be its whole extra video about all the problems with Magic the Gathering. I don't know that I necessarily want to get into all that. I'm mostly about like tabletop role-playing game kind of design guy. I have opinions about card games, but I'm like, it's not really my thing. So anyways, those are my card game opinions and opinions about resource systems in general. Kind of a scattered business, but I guess if we wanted to come away with a bottom line, a conclusion for the entire video, resource systems are really important. And when you're designing a game, you need to think carefully about not only how the players are going to interact with these resource systems, but also what sorts of incentives are you creating for the players? What is it that the players are going to do while interacting with these resource systems in order to generate more or to maximize them or to stretch them out or whatever they need to do? And what sort of play experience does that create? Do you want the action, the dynamics, the interesting parts of the game to sort of ramp up over time? Or do you want them to start high and ramp down over time? And those two approaches have different implications for, with regards to like what we would call the adventuring day in an RPG. And the video is way too long already, so I'm not going to get into the dynamics of an adventuring day. I guess that'll be the next video. The adventuring day and the problems with that idea, particularly in D&D. But anyways, yeah, resource systems are important, and some are kind of better than others.